That's it? It's working. Okay, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are glad to see you here, and I'm happy to introduce our distinguished speaker, Jan Bond, Director of Foreign Policy at the Center for European Reform, and he has spent in the Foreign Office 28 years. Uh, Positions in Washington, in Russia. He was ambassador to Latvia, and he also has experience working at the UK delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in NATO, so a very experienced person who has um, mastered different fields in foreign policy. So with all this experience, this is a very distinguished speaker. So I will give the floor to Mr. Bond. He will speak for 20 minutes, and then I hope you will be ready to ask questions. Because, well, this is a great opportunity to hear a person who has first-hand knowledge of the issue. So please, Mr. Bond.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Прежде всего, хотел бы поблагодарить Андрея и его команду за возможность. I'm going to continue in English for very obvious reasons, but this is my first visit to your new headquarters, and I must say you have a very nice space here, so I hope that we will be able to collaborate on future occasions as well. I admit that when I was preparing for this event, I wondered whether I needed to worry about giving away any secrets about the weaknesses of the British position. But it seems to me that there are probably enough people in Moscow who understand the weaknesses of the British position that I don't need to worry about that at all. But what I plan to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to talk a bit about where the Brexit process is at the moment in the UK, with the caveat that it is evolving quite rapidly and that there may be surprises even as we are sitting here. Then I want to make some assumptions and think about some scenarios and to look at how Brexit is likely to affect the UK in a couple of areas. So first of all, in terms of its economic and trade policy, and secondly, in terms of its foreign and security policy. And then to switch the perspective and to look at those same questions as they affect the EU. And finally, and rather hesitantly, and I think leaving most of the work to be done by Elena, to consider the implications of all of this for Russia. So where we stand at the moment is that in exactly a week's time, the European Council will meet and will discuss what to do about Brexit. One thing that is worth underlining is that this is quite an important European Council, even without Brexit being on the agenda, because there will be a discussion of the negotiations on the EU's next 7-year budget, which is of much more importance to the members as they look into the future than the Brexit negotiations. And because it will be discussing the priorities of the new Commission, which takes office on the 1st of November. So that is quite an urgent set of tasks in terms of ensuring that the Commission is pointing in the right direction for the next 5 years. It's a fantasy of pro-Brexit politicians and campaigners that the EU remains desperate to keep the UK as a member of the EU. There is increasing opinion polling evidence that actually most European publics would now like the UK to leave. I may regret that, but I fear it is a fact. And the discussions that the CER has had with European officials and member state officials over the last few months also suggest that they are really focused on bringing this process to an end, ideally with an agreement, but if not with an agreement, then other European countries feel that they are as well prepared as they can be. The Commission has issued I think about 100 Brexit preparedness notices in different sectors, and has made somewhere around 50 legislative amendments to take account of areas in which the UK will no longer be participating. So a lot of work has been done. The most difficult issue is still how to deal with the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And this, to me, is essentially an insoluble problem as things stand. The root of it is a trilemma that was created by Theresa May when she set out her red lines for the UK's future relationship with the EU in the autumn of 2016 and the beginning of 2017. In relation to Northern Ireland, she set three objectives. The first was to leave the single market and the customs union. The second was to have the same Brexit for the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland. And the third was to have no border checks of any kind between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And the problem was then and remains that the UK can have any two of these three objectives, but not all three at once. So the two options that have been tried so far, neither of which commanded a majority in the British Parliament because of opposition from different groups of MPs, was first of all, and proposed by the EU, that Great Britain, so that is to say England, Wales and Scotland, that Great Britain should leave the single market and the customs union. That maintained an open border on the island of Ireland, but it meant that Brexit would be very different depending on whether you were on the mainland of Great Britain or in Northern Ireland. The second option then was counter-proposed by the UK to deal with that problem. And that meant that the UK as a whole would remain aligned with the single market and part of the customs union. And the effect of that was that Brexit would be the same or almost the same for the whole of the UK. And the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland would remain open. But the UK would not be leaving, at least in any significant way, the single market or the customs union for an indefinite period. That was unacceptable to a different group of MPs. Now, the solution that Boris Johnson is pursuing with the proposals that he put forward to the EU last week is to say that the whole of the UK will leave the customs union, but Great Britain, so that's to say again England, Wales, Scotland, will leave the single market, while Northern Ireland will remain in the single market at least for goods. And this means that there will be some kind of checks on goods travelling between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and vice versa. So Brexit will not mean the same thing throughout the UK, but it also means that there will be some kind of customs border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, so there will be no open border on the island of Ireland. And for reasons that I still don't understand, Boris Johnson claims to be confident that, that this deal, which meets none of Theresa May's original three objectives, can get through Parliament, when previous attempts, which have at least met two of her three objectives, have not been able to get through Parliament. And in any case, his ideas have been rejected by the EU because they don't meet any of the EU's major objectives, namely preserving the single economic space on the island of Ireland and preserving the integrity of the European single market. Now, Boris Johnson and the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar are meeting today So a lot may change, but it seems to me that it's more likely that it won't change. Then I think it's quite likely that next week Boris Johnson will be forced by the operation of British law to ask for an extension of the UK's membership of the EU beyond the 31st of October. But I don't think that that will actually bring a long-term solution. I think we will continue to go round the same set of problem issues. And I think, therefore, that there is a high probability that we will leave the EU one way or another without a deal rather than with one. And as I said on social media recently, in trying to think of how I would explain the situation, it seems to me that what the British government is trying to do at the moment is to jump off the roof of a high building without a parachute and to blame the ground when the landing hurts. So that's the situation that we're in at the moment. Now, how things develop in future depends on just how much it hurts when we hit the ground. And I think there are a variety of foreseeable scenarios, some of which involve us finding ways back to a relatively close relationship with the EU, some of which involve a much more distant relationship. There are some limiting factors on how bad relations can get, and particularly in the security and defence area, because of our NATO membership and because of the fact that 21 other EU member states are also members of NATO, there will be certain areas in which we are obliged to keep cooperating. And economically, whatever you wish to do, you can't actually dismantle the economic connections that have been built up over the last 46 years in the space of a day or a week or even a year. But within those constraints, there are several approaches that the UK could take to its future policies. So looking at the trade and economic issues to begin with, I mean, the first approach, and the one which most of British business would prefer, is that you stay very closely aligned with the EU regulations and standards, and you focus on getting a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and in particular one which goes beyond previous agreements in the sense that it covers some significant part of the services sector, which makes up a very big part of the UK's economy and a big part, about 40% of our trade with the EU, or certainly our exports to the EU. So that's economically a very rational approach. Now, it's clear already that part of the EU's price for such an agreement is that the UK also remains aligned with the EU on labour standards, on environmental standards and the like. So again, certain limits on freedom of action. So the second approach, which is favoured by quite a lot of Conservative MPs who are very much in favour of global free trade, is that the UK should look away from Europe altogether. They regard Europe as being an area in economic decline, and it should instead look to the United States and to big emerging markets like India and China and to the British Commonwealth. And if necessary, radically revise product standards to accommodate partners who don't necessarily have such high standards in a variety of areas. And the example which is also always used in the British press of this is that America allows chicken carcasses to be treated with chlorine or chlorinated solution in order to kill bacteria, something which the EU regards as merely masking bad hygiene practices in agriculture and posing a threat to human health. So the UK may or may not be willing to relax its standards to meet that. And then I suppose for completeness' sake, I should say that there is a third model, which is what you would probably get if at the next election we end up with a Labour government. And that is to transform the UK economy away from its traditional relatively laissez-faire capitalist model, its sort of Anglo-Saxon capitalist model, and to have more nationalisation in key sectors like transport and public utilities, some state subsidies, higher labour and environmental standards, and to deal with the loss of competitiveness on global markets through sort of more non-market-based solutions. So perhaps some protectionism, some state subsidies, which might not meet EU regulations on these issues. Now, paradoxically, at the moment, what the government is doing is a bit of all three of these things. So there are promises to respect, at least from, let's say, from the ministry that deals with agriculture, there are promises to respect high environmental and food safety standards. There are also tariffs set high enough to protect certain sectors of the economy. But equally, in some areas, tariffs are being reduced to zero, even if that means that some of our industries will be exposed to a much greater degree of competition than they are used to and possibly than they can survive. In the foreign and defence policy area, I've already alluded to the constraints posed by our NATO membership. Even so, I think there is still some scope to choose between different models. First of all, again, you can adopt a very close relationship with the EU, and indeed, at the very outset of the negotiations process, the UK put forward some proposals to the EU for something that came close to a kind of associate membership, in which the UK would not actually be in the room for EU meetings on foreign policy issues, but it would have almost weekly high-level contacts with the EU in order to make sure that it could feed in its views. I think the price of that would have been an acceptance on the part of the UK that we would have to then go along with any consensus that formed, that we would not both have very close and intimate access to EU thinking on different foreign policy issues and then go off and pursue an entirely independent approach. The second possible approach in the foreign policy area would be the kind of thing which I think some traditional conservatives like Liam Fox, the former defence and later foreign trade minister, would favour, which is to have a very close relationship again with the United States, to pivot away from the EU and to focus on the transatlantic relationship, and to focus in a sense on making the UK as useful as possible to the Americans. Now, there is a certain level of support for this in the British Parliament and among conservative thinkers, people who believe, for example, that when the UK has got its 2 aircraft carriers fully operational with aircraft on them, which doesn't at the moment, but they're getting there, that those ships should be deployed in the areas where they might be most helpful to US security policy, say, in the Middle East or even in the Western Pacific. And those people suggest that you can only ever get Europe to take its own defence seriously and to start sharing the burden of defence seriously if the UK and the US show that they are serious about moving their assets elsewhere and focusing on other parts of the world. Now, I think this argument is less attractive to many in the UK in the era of Trump than it would have been in the era of Obama. And then again, for completeness' sake, if we get a Labour government, I think you would probably see a rather different kind of British foreign policy, one which focused much more on human rights, on environmental issues globally, climate change and so on, that would certainly not be aligned with almost anything that the US does under Trump, that would look at, or look more favourably on governments who feel that they are at the sharp end of US neo-imperialism, say Venezuela or countries like that, and would be less interested in some of the traditional alliances. Now, I don't want to push this too far. It's worth saying that in its 2017 manifesto, the Labour Party did say, as part of the election campaign in 2017, that it would maintain the NATO target of 2% of GDP spent on defence. So, I'm not suggesting that you would deal with an entirely pacifist Labour Party, but I do think that Labour Party foreign and security policy would be less likely to join the US in foreign adventures than probably the Conservatives have been or would be. Now, if one looks at this from the EU side, the first thing to say is that in a variety of areas, the departure of the UK is going to shift the centre of gravity in the EU, and that is going to have consequences. In the economic field, perhaps less than we might expect, but there will still be some changes. So, I mean, the caricature of the EU has been that, you have the kind of statist, dirigiste French approach, and you have the free market UK approach. It's never been quite as straightforward as that. And there is a significant block of economically liberal countries now within the EU, and an attachment to the single market, which to some extent was originally a British creation, which I think is not going to disappear just because the British disappear. So 17 countries, led by Finland before Finland took up its rotating presidency of the EU, wrote a letter earlier in the year promoting an economic liberalization agenda. And I think that remains a program which is going to be central to what the new Commission does, looking at the priorities that they've set out. I do think there might be some changes in competition policy. France and Germany are starting to look at competition from state-owned or state-encouraged mega corporations, particularly in China, and to think that Europe needs to stop concentrating on the breakup of European monopolies and quasi-monopolies and encouraging maximum competition at a purely European level, and to think about the creation of European champions that are able to compete with the Chinese on a global level. I think in terms of the Capital Markets Union, again, there may be some changes because of the departure of, or the fact that the City of London will now be outside the EU. That may change the way that the EU looks at the question of how it needs to raise capital. What we don't know yet is whether the answer to that will be for Europe to try to integrate itself more into global capital markets, whether that's London or New York or elsewhere, or whether it will actually say, well, we need to try and find more capital within Europe itself. One of the paradoxes is that, in a sense, it has to look outside at the moment, but maybe that's not permanent. In the foreign policy area, I think there are more likely to be procedural than substantive innovations in common foreign and security policy. There does seem to be a significant level of support for introducing at least some majority voting into CFSP, and that's something that the UK would certainly have vetoed. It's not straightforward. There are some smaller states that fear the loss of the veto would mean that their views would always be overridden by France and Germany or other big states. And at the moment, the Commission and others who favour this have proceeded very cautiously in terms of the number of areas that might be covered by this. We're only looking at a very limited number of areas so far. But I think this would make a marginal improvement in foreign policy decision making, but what it's not going to solve is the bigger weaknesses of CFSP. There are two structural weaknesses. The first is that even though the Lisbon Treaty created a high representative for foreign policy who was also a vice president of the Commission, that relationship still doesn't work terribly well. The high representative is still a relatively weak actor within the European Commission, and institutionally weak, and unable to coordinate the external policy instruments of the EU in the way that was envisaged when the Lisbon Treaty was being drawn up. So the result is that it still sometimes feels as though EU policy is quite incoherent. The second structural weakness is that CFSP remains an area of primarily intergovernmental cooperation, but that gives governments a good deal of freedom to pursue their own foreign policies. And sometimes those come back into CFSP in a sort of helpful way. And you could take, for example, the Iran nuclear negotiations, which began as an initiative of the UK, France, and Germany, and were then brought back inside an EU framework, and that worked very well. But on other occasions, and I would take the Normandy format dealing with the conflict in Ukraine as being a particularly good example of this, the Normandy format remains still off to one side as far as the majority of the EU is concerned, and there isn't a sort of institutional role for the High Representative in the Normandy process. But the biggest problem of all with CFSP after Brexit is a lack of political ambition in the foreign policy sphere. The fact is that if the UK and France in particular have been able to agree to take initiatives, then they've usually been able to move things forward because they have a global outlook, partly because of their permanent membership of the Security Council. They take an interest in conflicts and tension and international situations well beyond the borders of Europe. The UK was particularly active in, for example, using EU machinery to pursue goals in the Horn of Africa, an area which for most EU member states posed very little interest and very little threat, but for which a certain number of countries was actually quite important, those with shipping interests primarily. So I think now we're putting a lot of stress on France as the last country in the EU with a global outlook willing to drive external policy. And I'm just not sure that that is going to work very well. And I can't see the EU aligning itself with any of the other major powers. So it seems to me that certainly under Donald Trump, the foreign policy relationship between the EU and the US is going to be weaker. And China, I think it's too complicated at this stage to be thinking about foreign policy cooperation with China and indeed with Russia, except perhaps in one or two very narrow areas like the Iran deal. Likewise, in the defence area, the departure of the UK removes a veto from certain forms of EU activity, including in the defence industrial sector. But it also leaves you with a much reduced level of ambition. Again, the UK is a big contributor in the defence area and in the defence industrial sector. And if the EU adopts, as seems likely, quite a restrictive view on collaboration with third countries in defence industrial projects, then I think that will be even more of a problem. Lastly, let me just touch very, very briefly on the possible implications for Russia. I mean, I hope it is not speaking out of turn to say that I'm sure there will be some people in the Kremlin who feel very satisfied with their work and the contribution that they made to the Brexit debate before the referendum. Perhaps not a decisive contribution, but it was pretty clear on which side of the scales the Russian thumb was resting. But I would say, always be careful what you wish for. because although in some respects the UK has been quite a tough partner, it has also been willing to look pragmatically at areas of international policy, particularly where it could work with Russia, and with a certain fragmentation of the EU approach, it seems to me that some of that cooperation may be harder to achieve. I think President Macron is clearly trying to do a sort of a reset of relations with Russia, but it's not clear to me that he has the level of trust from countries in Central and Eastern Europe and indeed in Northern Europe that the UK had, precisely because people knew that we were quite skeptical about the possibilities for a much warmer relationship with Russia. The other thing I would say, and this is my final point, is that in the economic sphere, it's hard to see many upsides for Russia from Brexit. This is going to be a disruption to one of Russia's biggest trading partners. However it turns out, it is going to be a disruption. There will be a certain level of distraction, and for those of the elite who are lucky enough to own property in London, they're going to see the value of their assets going down. I suppose for those who don't yet own property in London, there may be an opportunity there. But it does seem to me that on the whole, this is something which, to the extent that it may cause some economic turbulence and some reduction in growth across Europe, could actually work against the interests of Russia, at least in the short to medium term. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Mr. Bond, thank you for your very interesting and profound report, especially for a person who is, so to say, inside all this, because while studying UK and Brexit in Moscow, from Moscow, we don't sometimes feel the atmosphere or important details. So again, thank you very much for your report. And I will now turn to our audience and please introduce yourself when you ask a question.
Okay. Yes. So thank you very much for your report, and I want to know about your position about the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. We know that after 2017 elections, as Irish newspaper wrote, Theresa May got to bed with the Democratic Unionist Party, and we know that from the beginning they were against any proposal of from Brexit and for Brexit and from the for the border, and because from their point of view it threatened the unique position, the union of the United Kingdom. But the last proposal of Boris Johnson, they supported it because he proposed to leave Northern Ireland and custom union, it's clear, but he proposed to give the Stormont institutions the veto to regulatory alignment for every 4 years, and so they can block these negotiations. And the position of the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Arlene Foster, it's very contradictory, because at the beginning she was against any border, and against the border, sea border. And now she advocates this position, and so she Christians like two border woman, because she one leg in the single market and the second leg in the custom union. And so what do you think about their position and how it can influence on these negotiations and especially this meeting today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry, could you introduce yourself? Could you?
Sorry, my name is Elena Polikova. I am from Institute of General History, and I study Irish and Northern Irish history. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for the question. I think if you study Irish and Northern Irish history, perhaps I should be asking you for advice. I mean, I find the DUP's new position much harder to understand than their old position. Their old position had the advantage of being consistent about their opposition to any borders between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, whereas their new position seems to be it's okay to have a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland as long as there is also a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. From an economic point of view, they've gone from Theresa May's proposals, which in many respects offered them the best of both EU membership and being part of the UK outside the EU, to a set of arrangements which in some ways would make business in Northern Ireland worse off in terms of their trade in both directions. So I find this paradoxical. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that the one cynical explanation for this is that the Stormont veto in Boris Johnson's proposals is designed in such a way that the Northern Irish Assembly has to agree before these arrangements can come into force. And of course, as you will well know, the Northern Ireland Assembly has not met for 2.5 years, and therefore, as long as it doesn't meet, the arrangements will never come into force. But you know, that may be too cynical. But if they seriously want to bring these arrangements into force, then it's quite hard to see how this would be anything other than economically disastrous for Northern Ireland, but also politically, because whatever Boris Johnson says about not having the customs posts at the border, in the political circumstances of Northern Ireland, wherever you put customs posts, it is a representation of the border, and it's the border which is politically unacceptable to the nationalist community. The other possibility, I suppose, is that when we get to the next election, the DUP may have less influence anyway, and then it may be easier to find other solutions. But none of us knows when that might be.
So please, young man over there, yes. And please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Sergey Dodia. I'm a student of Higher School of Economics, and I wanted to ask you, thanks for your report, by the way. I wanted to ask you about the prospective trade between UK and US. So how good might the new trade deal be for the UK, and what sectors of the economy might be most interesting for both countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The likelihood is that any UK-US trade deal will not make a decisive difference to the prospects for the British economy. I mean, although the US is an extremely important trading partner for the UK already, any trade deal that we do is not going to make up for the loss of the single market. I think that's important to underline. The big problem with doing trade deals with the US is that in the sectors that really matter to the UK, and again, I come back to the services area, many of the regulations are set at the state level. So if I take the example of the insurance industry, there isn't even a single market in insurance within the United States itself. You know, there are many forms of insurance which cannot be sold across state borders. And so that's something over which the federal government has very little control. So you negotiate a deal with the federal government, and then the states are a law unto themselves in those areas for which they have competence. I mean, another area is shipping, where you have something which the Americans have had since almost for 100 years, the so-called Jones Act, which limits cargoes carried between American ports to ships built in America, owned by Americans and crewed by Americans. And again, that means that, you know, UK interests would be severely limited. The Americans are not going to repeal that law for the sake of the UK. I think there will be some areas in which the UK could benefit, perhaps in the automotive sector, in some areas of financial services, in some areas of agriculture and food. But there is also a big ask from the American side in terms of, as I mentioned in my presentation, Britain lowering the food and agricultural standards from where they are currently with the EU to admit chlorinated chickens and hormone-treated beef and all the other horrors of the American food industry that Europeans think will poison them. I mean, I lived in Washington for 5 years. I'm sure I ate a lot of chlorinated chicken, and it hasn't killed me. But you know, there is I think on the part of many consumers, even in the UK, there's a feeling that this is not something that they want to eat. And on the part of farmers in the UK, there is a feeling that if American farmers are allowed to sell this into the UK market, then they will wipe out the British agricultural sector because of the economies of scale that we could never compete with, simply, you know, because of the relative size of our country and our ability to farm it intensively. So that's one area. Pharmaceuticals is another area where the Americans feel that they face an unfair market in the UK because of the monopoly power of the National Health Service, and where in the sort of negotiating goals that the US has already set out, it's clearly looking to make it harder for the National Health Service to keep the price of pharmaceuticals low. So those are areas where I think the Americans would see themselves as having opportunities if they can put enough pressure on the UK.
So please, next question. Your turn.
Alexander Alushin, IMMO. Thank you very much for your report. It was very interesting. I want to ask about future cooperation in defense and security in case of no deal. What do you think, first of all, about PESCO and UK participation in PESCO? Because in a political declaration that was published a year ago, parties told that they're looking for a unique partnership in this sphere.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of no deal, I think it's quite hard to see how that would work with UK participation in PESCO and other European defence projects. I think the UK was quite disappointed with the initial reaction from the EU side in some of these areas. So if one looks in particular at the Galileo question, the UK had hoped that it would be able to carry on taking part in Galileo almost as though it had not left the EU. And the EU view was, well, no, we have rules for the relationship between Galileo and third countries, and you will be a third country, so you'll have to abide by those rules. And I think the more bad-tempered a no-deal breakup is, the less likelihood there is that the EU will make any special accommodations for the UK. I think even if there is a deal, some of these questions are going to be quite difficult. There is still a big debate going on in the EU, which is not just about the UK, it's also about the US, about how much Europe wants to let third countries into defence industrial cooperation. And this is partly about how do you grow a defence industrial sector if a lot of the money is actually flowing not to European defence industrial concerns, but to third country defence companies. So there's still a lot of debate. I mean, this is not all settled, and countries like Sweden, which already have a close defence industrial relationship with the US, and one or two others, are actually quite interested in trying to keep the doors as open as possible. But I don't think we're going to be able to pretend, that we're, for certain purposes, still inside the tent. And then I think, if I can just take it a step further, if one looks at defence operational areas, there again, I think the UK started with very ambitious ideas about being able to shape operations from the start, whereas the EU's view was, no, we shape the operation, and then we invite you to contribute to it, on the same basis as other third countries. And I think for the UK, that's really not very satisfactory. They don't want always to be just coming in to provide troops or other assets at a stage where all the thinking about the concept of operations and so on has already been done. Now, there may be pragmatic ways forward. I think we already have a UK-French defence and security relationship, which is quite close. I think that's something that you'll see an attempt to work through some of these issues in bilateral or minilateral formations with the major players in Europe. But again, I don't think it will be exactly a substitute for what we have now.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for the report. It was very informative. My question regards financial markets. As you well know here, London is one of major global financial centers, and it has strong connections not only with EU financial markets, but with Asian and US markets, especially stock markets. In case of especially no-deal Brexit, how big is the likelihood of major turbulence or disruption on global financial and stock markets? Is there a risk of major disruption, somewhat like a black swan that happened in 2008? Thank you.
I mean, I should say that I'm not a specialist in financial markets, so that's a very important caveat in these circumstances. But my understanding from contacts with some financial services companies is that many of them have made quite extensive contingency plans for Brexit of whatever kind, and that they probably feel they have done as much as they can to insure themselves against the impact. We'll probably only know whether they have or not on the morning after it happens. But I think, I mean, the impact may be quite mixed because, for example, one thing that is quite foreseeable is that the pound, which has been declining pretty much since the Brexit referendum, might decline more sharply if there is a no-deal Brexit. Indeed, every time it looks as though the prospects for a deal are getting worse, you see the pound drop by a few more percentage points. So it seems to me, that may well happen. But because of the structure of the London Stock Exchange, and particularly the FTSE 100 index, which has a lot of companies which make a lot of their revenue outside the UK, paradoxically, a slump in the pound often brings a rise in the stock market. So, what will take longer to work out is the impact on the real economy in the UK. Those effects will be probably slower to develop and longer lasting. But whether they have much effect on the City of London and its ability to act as a global financial centre, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of what the City of London does has very little to do with the continent of Europe anyway, and should therefore be able to carry on running. There are some people who say that actually the bigger effect will be on the ability of European companies to access funds in London, but again, it remains to be seen.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Alexey Kuznetsov. I'm professor at Financial University here in Moscow. Thank you very much for a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I have a question to the option after Brexit. You mentioned that the UK could look away from the EU towards United States, China, more closely cooperation. But today, United States have problems with China, trade war, currency war, etc. How the UK think to avoid those problems without breaking, at the same time, special relationship with United States? Thank you.
Yes, that's another trilemma, probably. I think it's extremely difficult for me to see how you can do that, really. And I would say, I mean, it's not just the US. We also have high ambitions of developing a closer relationship with, at least in the economic sector, developing a closer relationship with India. And the dynamics between India and China are never entirely straightforward. What I would say is that at the moment, the relationship with China is not as warm as it was in the period when David Cameron was Prime Minister. David Cameron and George Osborne were very enthusiastic, and that was reflected in the state visit that Xi Jinping paid to London, when they announced that there was a new golden era in relations. I don't think anybody's talking about a golden era now. So the relationship has become, I mean, suspicious may be too strong a word, but it's cooled somewhat, and the UK is looking more cautiously on issues like Chinese involvement in the 5G network and Chinese involvement in big infrastructure projects in the UK. That's not to say that they won't necessarily go ahead, but the UK will scrutinize them more closely. So I would expect that, in some ways we will still look first to our traditional partner in the United States. But it is hard to know exactly what United States we may be looking at, particularly if Trump is re-elected. And it may be that we have to look elsewhere for some of our friendships, depending on the way that things develop. Trump is not an easy partner. And going back to one of my scenarios, if you have a Labour government, I think they would very definitely be looking away from the United States. Not necessarily to China, probably not to China, but looking for more partners of a small L liberal kind, with an interest in human rights, development assistance. So I mean, depending on what happens in the Canadian elections, Canada might be a natural partner, for example. Norway, countries like that. But yeah, I mean, I think to keep good relations with the US and China at the same time is going to be extremely challenging and probably beyond the skills of any foreseeable British government.
Well, I'm very glad that there are many questions, and I would like everybody to be satisfied because of this great opportunity. So please introduce yourself.
My name is Anna Kozlova. I'm the third-year student of the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Thank you very much for your speech. And I have a question on the future of the UK. So now we can see that facing such a complicated problem, the British political system cannot work properly, and there is no mechanism of somehow overcoming this problem. So, in your opinion, if Brexit can cause some changes in the legislative or the executive system of the UK, and if it can, what kind of changes will it be? Thank you.
You know what the most worrying thing I have heard in the last week or so has been? That is two people comparing the UK in its current situation to their own countries that broke up. You mentioned the breakup of the Soviet Union, but last week somebody from the former Yugoslavia said to me, there are a lot of things that feel very familiar. And I found that really profoundly worrying. I don't guarantee that the UK is going to split up, but I think it's a more than negligible risk. And I myself have said, actually, since before the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, that it seemed to me that one of the biggest risks to the continuation of the United Kingdom was not separatism on the periphery, but frustration at the center. The sense from the English that they subsidize Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's a very, and again, this is where I think the parallel with the Soviet Union comes in. It's an unbalanced federation, where, as in the Soviet system, there were no Russian Federation institutions until a very late stage, were there? And so you don't have an English Parliament, but you do have Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Assembly, and a Northern Ireland Assembly. And I think that's something that because England makes up such a big part of the United Kingdom, it's actually quite hard to federate it in that way. You know, you're always going to have England being predominant in the family, as it were. But it does seem to me that we have to think about our constitutional arrangements if we are going to survive as a union. And we're not doing enough of that. In fact, in many ways, Brexit is making things worse, is exacerbating the tensions. You know, Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to remain part of the European Union. In 2014, one of the arguments that the British government made as to why Scots ought to vote to remain part of the United Kingdom was that if they voted for independence, they would no longer be members of the European Union. And suddenly they find that they vote for the United Kingdom, but they're being dragged out of the European Union against their will anyway. So it does seem to me that there's a problem there. We've talked about Northern Ireland. The demographics of Northern Ireland are gradually moving towards those who favour union with Ireland, so reunification of the island of Ireland. They're moving slowly, and there are a lot of people for whom this would be a cause for which they would take up arms. But at the same time, Ireland now is not the country that it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's a very progressive, modern, a country which is comfortable with itself in a way that 30 or 40 years ago, when it seemed to be very much under the control of the Catholic Church, very sectarian, very obsessed with its history with the British, it felt much more hostile to a Northern Irish audience, and that doesn't seem to be the case any longer. So I mean, I think, I'm not sure what my life expectancy is, but you know, let us assume that the average British male lives to something over 80. I'd say that there was probably a more than 50% chance that if I live to that age, I will be living in England and Wales rather than in the United Kingdom. I hope I'm wrong, but I think there's a serious chance of that.
Any more? Yes, please.
My name is Oleg Akhushin, senior researcher in the Institute of Europe. Thank you very much for the informative report. And as we know, a bulk of people in Scotland were against the withdrawal from the European Union, and 62% of Scots voted in favor of staying in the European Union, and the Scotland National Party was against it. As we know, on Saturday, thousands of people participated in pro-independence rally in Edinburgh against the withdrawal and for the independence. And my question is, how do you think, what is the perspective for independence in Scotland, and is the independence the best way for development of Scotland? Because Nicola Sturgeon thinks that the independent country will face with problems with national debt or other problems in economic and social sphere, but it will overcome it. So what do you think about it? Thank you.
Now, I don't know what level of tolerance for disruption the Scottish people have in the short term. So as I say, I mean, I think in the long term there is a very high probability of Scotland getting its independence. But in the short term, there are two ways of looking at this. I mean, one is that if you're going to be disrupted by leaving the EU, if you're going to be economically disrupted by leaving the EU, you don't want to double that by also disrupting your links with England, which is, by far the biggest economic partner of Scotland. And you've got to remember that it's vanishingly unlikely that Scotland would be able simply to remain in the EU, as opposed to applying as a normal through the normal accession process. Now, you could say the accession process could be speeded up, but it still has to be ratified by all the other member states, including some which are very hostile to separatism, notably Spain. Now, I think the PSOE government in Spain, if it survives, which is not clear, may be less hostile to Scottish independence and to Scotland joining the EU than the PP government would have been a few years ago. But they're not enthusiastic about this. Even though the Scots have been really careful about making clear that they are in a different constitutional position from Catalonia, it's still something, I think, which is of concern to Spain, that you don't want to establish a precedent that a bit of your country can break away and immediately join the EU. So the process might be a rather slow one, and so you're doubling the amount of disruption. In terms of, is this the right course of development? I mean, it would be paradoxical for me when actually I think that the UK is making a big mistake by breaking away from its biggest market, to suggest that it would be smart for Scotland to break away from its biggest market. I think these are both fundamentally dumb moves. Just physically, I mean, this would be much more disruptive than, I mean, in a narrow sense, much more disruptive than, say, the breakup of the Soviet Union, because of the integration of the economies over several hundred years, and the lack of any tradition of there being a real border there since the late Middle Ages. It seems to me that, I mean, maybe in the long term, Scotland would develop in the same way that, say, the Baltic states or others have developed. But the amount of pain that they would have to go through to get there, regardless of how the rest of the UK might react to it, regardless of any difficulties that England might put in their way, I think the pain that they would have to go through simply from cutting themselves off from their main market would be enormous and not really worth it.
Oh my God! So your speech is a total success. I think everybody wants to ask you a question, and then I'll leave my question the last. So since I've said we have this unique opportunity, could you please go on answering the questions?
Yeah, with pleasure. I'll carry on answering questions till my voice runs out, but then I want to ask you a question as well.
Certainly. Хорошо, Елена.
My name is Елена Karitonova. I'm from IMMO. My question is a kind of a personal question to you. I saw reports about public mood in the UK, that people are starting to feel depressed, not wanting to watch news about Brexit anymore because they're starting to get tired of the theme. What about the academic community? On the one hand, it's an interesting topic. You can discuss it, and there's always something to work on. On the other hand, maybe you personally also feel, I don't know, not very happy about what's going on. So what's your personal take on the situation and the take of your colleagues, maybe? Thank you.
I mean, that is an extremely perceptive question because, I mean, in a way, we all like to be objective researchers, but this is something which affects us rather closely and personally. I mean, I would say that for the majority of people who are engaged in this field academically or in think tanks or other institutions, it's quite depressing. This is, most of us, in a sense, think that for all its faults, and the European Union has many faults, the EU is a good project which needs improvement rather than a bad project that you should get rid of. And so it's quite depressing when you know that that actually, the government profoundly disagrees with that point of view. I think the other thing that is important to recognize is that a very large part of the academic community, not only dealing with political science and international relations, but generally in the UK, comes from other parts of the EU. Academic exchanges all across Europe, but particularly in places with universities with a sort of high reputation like the UK, have been intense over the last 30 or 40 years. And so for those who come from other European countries, this is intensely personal. People who may have lived in the UK for decades but never needed to become British citizens are having to register to get what's called settled status, like to become, to have the right to remain as permanent residents. And in some cases, I mean, it's supposed to be a very simple procedure, but in some cases it's turning out to be very complicated. If people are junior researchers, they don't always earn enough, for example, to be able to have a spouse with them in the country. So it's very painful and very difficult and very psychologically disruptive for a lot of people in this community. And in society more widely, I can't remember the date when this was surveyed, but it was probably sort of 2014 or so. When people were asked, what are you concerned about politically? The EU hardly figured at all. People worried about the economy, they worried about migration, they worried about healthcare. The EU was, number 10 on a list of 9. So now it's become the defining factor. People choose their friendship groups on the basis of whether they voted Leave or Remain. We have some sort of family members of one of my children's partner who voted Leave, and we have to be very careful, what discussions we have when we meet them, because you don't want to get onto dangerous ground. So it's a painful and personal process for all of us.
Next question.
My name is Vasily. I'm from Moscow State University. I wonder, would you say that Brexit opens a new possibility for UK dealing with Central Eastern European countries, bearing in mind first that Theresa May, right after the Brexit voting, started to engage with them, and then European Union institutions started to lower down this tension between them, but bearing in mind the possibility of no deal, bearing in mind the possibility of Scotland accession and the problems related to universal approval of a new member state. From your point of view, would the
I mean, that's quite complicated because the UK has, I mean, first of all, the UK was one of the countries which was most in favour of enlargement to the Central and Eastern European countries. It was, in some respects, something which Margaret Thatcher, who didn't like, I mean, there were a lot of things about the European Union that Margaret Thatcher did not like, but one of the things that she attached great importance to was the enlargement to the East, because she saw this as sort of righting a historic wrong. And if you go back and read the Bruges speech, which now is held up as a sort of original text of Euroscepticism in the UK, one of the messages that she wanted to underline in that was that, you know, we could not forget about the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. For some of them, the UK leaving feels like a bit of a betrayal. You know, it means that their closest partner in the EU is no longer going to be in the EU. For the last few years, there has been close cooperation in a so-called Nordic-Baltic group with the UK. And obviously that becomes much harder if the UK is no longer at the table. It is true that we have a shared antipathy to some forms of integration, although I think one should be careful about that, because some of these countries have joined the euro. Some of them intend to join the euro but are not ready yet. There are probably only a couple of countries which are actively intending not to join the euro, namely Poland and Hungary. And I think Poland, notwithstanding all the problems that Poland is having with the EU over the rule of law and other issues, Poland fundamentally does not see a future outside the EU. I mean, if you look at Polish opinion polls, the Polish population is just about the most pro-EU of any member state. You know, way more than some old member states like Italy or France. Now, the one exception that I might make is for Hungary, where I think Viktor Orban does see some opportunities for making mischief. And you know, there were suggestions a few days ago that the British government had been meeting the Hungarian foreign minister to try to get the Hungarians to veto any extension of the UK's membership of the EU, thereby frustrating the law passed by Parliament, which was designed to force Boris Johnson to ask for such an extension. Now, you know, this, from a legal point of view in the UK, this would be an extremely questionable action. But, you know, that thought was out there, and I can see that perhaps the Hungarians might see some value in mischief of that sort, except that once the UK is out of the EU, we're not in a position to protect Hungary either. And you've got the 7-year budget cycle about to start. You know, if people are looking at how do we spend less when we will have less revenue coming in because the UK won't be a member any longer, well, one place you could spend less is on the cohesion funds for Central and Eastern Europe, and you know, you might simply decide that Hungary is not making as good use of these funds as some other countries. So, you know, there are ways in which it would not be advantageous for any country to set itself too far outside the European mainstream in relation to the UK.
So, I think this is the last one, probably. Please.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for this interesting presentation. My name is Pavel. I'm a student of the Moscow State University, and I'd like to ask you a question about possibilities, perspectives, and of course influence. But look
Trump is one of the few world leaders who is unequivocally in favor of Brexit. The irony is Trump is also incredibly unpopular in the UK, and I suspect that whereas in 2016 Obama came to the UK and told us that if we voted for Brexit, we would be at the back of the queue for a trade deal with the United States. And that was actually perceived as possibly having made people vote the other way. Were Trump to have been the president then and come to the UK and said, Brexit is great, I'm all in favor of it, I think it would have produced an overwhelming vote against Brexit, given his level of unpopularity. But I mean, clearly he likes the idea, and it fits with his belief in nation states rather than multilateral organizations. But when it comes to trade, you know, his mantra is America first, and he is going to be looking in any trade negotiations with the UK for the things that bring advantages to the United States, not to do favors for the UK. I mean, I'm sure the relationship that we have with the United States, one way or another, will remain an extremely important one. Not least in the defense and security area. But I don't think Trump is going to treat us better or worse because of Brexit. I think he will be looking for where he can get advantages. As far as Germany is concerned, there is bound to be a negative impact on relations. You know, Germany is so firmly anchored in the European Union. It is so much a part of Germany's post-war identity that this is bound to have a negative impact. I mean, in economic terms, it will disrupt some important economic relations. Even if, you know, some of the damage can be mitigated, there will be an impact on the automotive sector, on financial services cooperation in a variety of areas. So I think it's bound to have a negative impact. In terms of German influence on the EU's work on Brexit, I mean, I think the Germans have done their best to play a helpful role. And to try to limit the damage that is caused. But at the end of the day, though the UK is an important economic partner for Germany, it's not as important as the whole of the rest of the single market. And so, you know, if it comes down to making choices between preserving the operation of the single market and doing something that Boris Johnson wants, the single market is going to win every time.
So, thank you very much. I mean the audience for your interest and for your questions. And now at last I can ask a question. So since I'm mostly doing research on domestic politics, so you know, I found myself very worried about the deterioration of political culture in the UK. We used to say that this is a pattern of Western democracy and so on. And now something awful is happening. And to me, well, all this stuff of Britain being on the verge of breaking the law, which this prorogation and breaking the law, which this prorogation of Parliament did show, well, all sides are trying to find loopholes in the law. Then the three branches of power clash with each other in an very ungentlemanly way. Well, I found that I'm looking up the dictionary to try trying to find the translation for some unparliamentary words. So, which I would not like to repeat in this audience of students, young people. And it seems to me that this deterioration will not, so to say, mend itself. This pattern of behavior might prevail. And bearing in mind that the UK doesn't have a written constitution, yes, all these conventions, traditions, it is just dissolving, and something very ugly is on the surface, yes, coming from the deep bottom. My question is, do you think that this will prevail, or somehow when this Brexit is well solved in any way, will it return back to normal? My view is that the two sides, whatever will happen, the two sides will blame each other for years and years.
I would love to be able to disagree with you on your analysis of the political situation, but I can't because I think you are absolutely right that something awful is happening. We have always been rather complacent about the virtues of the unwritten constitution, thinking that it was very flexible and it bent, but it didn't break, and we didn't have the problems that some other countries had had. You know, we sort of looked at the French with the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic and the Fifth Republic and thought, you know, a written constitution may be overrated. But it's turned out that it does have some weaknesses embedded in it when you are faced with people who want to work outside the conventions and the traditions. And back in the 1970s, Lord Hailsham, who was a very distinguished conservative Lord Chancellor, so you know the supreme law officer of the government, described the UK as an elective dictatorship. That's to say that once a government had been elected, because actually we don't really have three branches of power, or at least not in the same strictly limited way that the Americans do, sorry, delimited rather than limited. But once a government had achieved power, then its power was almost unlimited. And what held it in check was its understanding of the risks of going beyond its limits and setting precedents that could be used by future governments. And that, I think, is what's so worrying about the prorogation decision, was that no one in 10 Downing Street seems to have thought, well, it might be convenient for us to suspend discussions in Parliament until it's too late for Parliament to stop us doing something that Parliament doesn't want us to do. But how will we feel if there is a left-wing Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn in power, and they want to nationalise land held by big landowners in the UK, for example, and they face parliamentary opposition, so they suspend Parliament through the means of a long prorogation? How would we feel about that? And nobody seems to have asked that question. You know, the focus was on the short-term achievement. Things will never go back precisely to how they were before, partly because what the court has done, the Supreme Court has done, is to set some limits to this, is to say, we're not going to tell you how long you can prorogue Parliament for, but we are going to tell you that if you do it for too long and for the wrong reasons, we'll stop you. So that's good. I think if I want to be optimistic about this, the other positive thing that has come out of it is that there is more working across party lines to try to find ways forward. I don't always agree with the ways forward that they are trying to find, but that's not really the point. The point is that you have some Conservatives, some Labour, some Scottish National Party, Liberal Democrat politicians who are prepared to try to work together in the national interest, and not to say, you know, I have dug my trench here and you have dug your trench there, and we're going to stay in our own trenches and shoot at each other for the rest of our lives. So that, I think, may be a little cause for optimism. But if I may, I do want to ask you the question, how does this look to decision makers in Moscow? Because, you know, when I teased slightly in my presentation, but, you know, from London, it looks as though, you know, if you look at RT, or even if you look at Vladimir Putin's remarks about whether Theresa May should carry out Brexit, it looks as though, you know, the Russian view is that Brexit is a good thing. But I don't know whether that's a view which is shared widely, or it's just tactical.
No, I would like to remind you of the words by Putin right after the referendum. He said that this was a wrong step by Cameron. He was very light-minded, superficial. So this was a very negative assessment. And about the consequences, the impact, he said that, well, we don't know them yet. They may be negative or positive, but Russia will be, first of all, interested how the prices on commodities will go up or down. Yes, so probably Professor Alexei Kuznetsov could answer this question more precisely than me, if he would like to. He wrote a brilliant article for one of our editions on the consequences of Brexit, if not particularly on Russia. Well, you reminded, somebody in the audience reminded this Zurich speech of Churchill, yes? So for France and Germany never to go to war again. So Russia understands that perfectly well. So, but Russia suffered all the calamities of the Second World War. We know that perfectly well. So we would not like the EU to collapse. There will be war at our borders, so Russia doesn't like that at all. But what about the UK leaving the EU? Then this means that the United Kingdom was the first to demand sanctions, anti-Russian sanctions. The United Kingdom was the first to do many anti-Russian things and to try to introduce them into the into the European Union. So probably from this point of view, the anti-Russian front in the EU will be weakened. But we would not like the EU to collapse. So I've received, well, from the trader, the Russian trade representation, some well, points of view. They're economic, yes? So there will be bad consequences, there will be good consequences for Russia. But still, I stick to the point. Russia would not like the EU to collapse. But the UK leaving the EU, probably the consequence will be that there will be less anti-Russian sentiments.
Well, we shall see. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think one of the mistakes that British politicians have made for a long time is not to remember that the initial impulse for the creation of the coal and steel community and then the economic community and ultimately the union was as a peace process,
yes,
more than anything else.
Yes, exactly.
I think the British view was, I mean, which in a sense was represented by the term that was most commonly used when we joined the body, was that it was the common market. And it was the market that we wanted. I think there were some far-sighted politicians, even in the 1970s in the UK, who saw that it was a political process and part of the post-Second World War arrangements. But that was something which I fear David Cameron, indeed, rather superficially, never understood.
Yes, thank you. Well, I've read about the whole process of the whole way to the referendum, and this was Cameron making concessions to the Eurosceptics in his parliamentary party. And gradually, and there was a lot of democratic demagoguery.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that, as Marx said about the French Revolution, the revolution is eating up its own children. So here we can say that, well, to my horror, democracy is eating its own children. This democratic process is well, like a snake that it's eating its tail. This demagoguery. So how can you put such a question to the people who know absolutely nothing? This and binary question, yes or no. It's awful and undemocratic.
I think your point about putting a binary question is absolutely right. And in a way, I contrast the process with the way that the Irish have organised some very controversial referendums in recent years, where there is an intensive process of public debate through citizens' assemblies, so-called, before you get to the point where a question is put. And we never really had that kind of debate in the UK. from a very early stage, it was campaigning rather than saying, well, you know, there are a lot of different models for how you can leave the EU. You know, you could be like Norway, you could have a very close relationship with the EU, or you could have a much more distant relationship with the EU. What does that mean? In the run-up to the referendum, hardly anyone, except for Tony Blair and John Major, mentioned Northern Ireland at all. So we never really debated the issues around what would it mean for Northern Ireland if there were a border. You know, what does that mean for the identity of two communities in Northern Ireland who see the place that they live in very different ways? We simply didn't ask these questions, and now we're paying the penalty for not having asked them.
So, thank you very much. I think this seminar was a tremendous success, and from my point of view, questions are the mark of the report. If there are many questions, it means that it was very profound and interesting. So I would like to thank you very much on the part of the audience and on the part of the Russian International Relations Council. We would like to see you often. Thank you.
Well, I hope to see you in London as well. I hope to see you in London as well to continue your studies of UK domestic politics and to see how we're coping with Brexit. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you for coming here and for sitting for almost 2 hours listening to this.
So, thank you and goodbye.